Hi everyone. In case anyone needs the Wi-Fi password, it's right here. The Wi-Fi name is GLGuest, and the password is something like this. So yeah, help yourself. Pele. Should I start? Yeah, I'm just gonna give you 2 more minutes. Hello. You can come to the front if you want to. No, because it seems like he's struggling. So we're just waiting for him. Real quick. Yeah. Do you want it? Oh, Patrick. All good. Okay. Is everyone else here good as well? Awesome. All right, James. Okay. Um, Good evening, everyone. Welcome to GL, as in Devil's Playground. So I'll start off with fire exits. So we have fire exit from where you came from, which is somewhere there. And then we have another one past the kitchen. And then outside, our meeting point outside is outside Goucher, so somewhere down there. Now moving on to toilets. We have Patrick over there. He has the toilet passes. I mean, passes to enter the building in and out. Toilets are by the lifts. So, and remember to give the passes back as they're limited. Yeah, and now on to why we're here. Today's topic is TDD, presented to you by Chris. But before we get going, remember to sign up to the Slack community channel so we can offer technical support during the playground. This is mostly for those that are online, but for those that are here, just feel free to just put your hands up or ask myself, Patrick, or James for any help. And yeah, that's it. Let's go.
Who am I? That's me. My name's Chris Gongaloo. I'm told that. Oh, my slide's not showing. There we go. That's better. That's me when I was about 4 or 5. I've read that baby animals are less likely to be eaten if their parents consider them to be cute. So by showing this, I'm hoping you'll treat me well and you won't destroy me. That's my plea. But anyway, my name's Chris Gongaloo. I've been at Global Logic and previous companies before that for about 7 years-ish. The bulk of my career has been in QA, so test automation, largely in the sort of end-to-end UI space and BDD. And more recently, I've moved into sort of data engineering. I enjoy a good taco. I love tacos. And I try to play football when I can. And when I do, I try to be useful. So we're going to be going over TDD, and we're going to be using Python. From the beginning, I want to make it clear that this is less about Python and more about TDD. So if Python's not your primary programming language, or maybe you've never even touched Python before, that's okay. The README will allow you to copy and paste certain code modules. And if at any point you're stuck, please put your hand up, and I or the playground assistants will try and help you as well. But I want to use this time to focus more on what TDD is than teaching Python, because I'm pretty sure you guys can just go and Google that and learn about Python in your own time as well. Yep. Right. So just quick contents of what we're going to go through in terms of what problem is TDD trying to solve, definitions, its history, a little bit of history. You know, we're going to go into a bit of the benefits and drawbacks, and of course, we're going to do a playground as well. So, this is how a lot of people develop, and perhaps you've been in this situation before. You'll write some code, you'll push it up to your repo, you'll wait for some kind of CI/CD pipeline to build your code, be it Jenkins or Azure Pipelines or TeamCity. You'll wait for that to finish. If you're deploying some kind of web environment, you'll have to wait for the container to spin up, you'll have to wait for your code to be refreshed. You'll then do some kind of manual test on it, or only to find that there's either a code error or a syntax error or something that could have very easily been picked up offline. You're now seeing this in your environment, and you have to start the process all over again. You have to write some code, push to a pipeline, and do the whole thing over and over and over again. And you find yourself waiting quite a while for things to be deployed. And often what you're deploying, like the time that it takes, has very little to do with that one thing you're trying to address at that moment. Other problems you'll find is that you'll find that either your code hasn't been tested thoroughly enough, or in some cases not even tested at all, and sometimes it may even make its way to prod. And as I'm sure some of you will know, it is more expensive to fix defects in prod than it is to fix during your development time. And then when it comes to large, enterprise applications and large code bases, perhaps you've seen this as well, where a product owner will come and say, can you add this feature? Can you make this change? And you're not confident in making that change because you're worried that it's going to break a bunch of other things. And that's because either there's not good enough testing in place, or there's a monolithic manual testing process in place that you need to deal with. And so as a developer, you sometimes can feel that you don't have the confidence to change what could seemingly be a small thing because you're afraid it's going to cause some form of regression. And then the last thing is, what I've seen is that sometimes there is a gap between how the users understand how to use an application and how developers understand how to use the application. In other words, they think of the application very differently to how a user would think of it. And so there's a gap in keeping in mind how the customer, how your end user is going to use your application. TDD is an attempt to try and address those issues. Test-driven development. It's a development methodology, I would say, in where most of the time unit tests, sometimes integration tests, are written before developing your application code. And so what you're doing is you're thinking about, okay, what is this function supposed to be doing? What is this application supposed to be doing? And how do I know that that piece of functionality works? What objective test can we write that would prove that that piece of functionality works? And then you write that down in whatever your test framework is, you write that down. And even though you know that the application or that function doesn't exist yet, you're thinking about what it should do before you start writing your application code. And you're doing it in an iterative process. So you may not write the full test scope straight away. You may write small bits of it, write some code to pass that, and then develop on that. And so the idea is that you're growing the requirement fulfillment as you go along. In some cases, it may be easy enough just to put it all in one test, but you may grow it as you're building your application. And it's developed based on the developer's understanding of the application. But as you're writing tests, it's hopefully a collaborative process where you're learning from other people about how your application is being used. I'm not going to go through this table too much, but there's quite a lot of DD methodologies out there. There's TDD, which is test-driven development. There's acceptance test-driven development, ATDD, and there's BDD. ATDD and BDD, in my opinion, have a blurred line, but it's largely about thinking about what are the acceptance tests or the user requirements that are being fulfilled at the end-to-end level. TDD is a bit more granular, and it looks into how do specific components work and how do you know that they work as well. I've seen instances where TDD can very much be used in a BDD sort of way because the requirements are so similar. the idea of writing tests for your code is fairly old, but as from what I've read and what I can see, the idea of having a test-first approach came from Kent Beck, and it was, you can say, discovered, maybe rediscovered back in 2003. And he wrote a book, Test-Driven Development by Example. I'll confess, I haven't read the book end to end, but I've read enough of it and tried enough of the examples to see what he was getting at. So that's kind of its origins and where it came from. The TDD flow. So what we're looking at is the general flow of TDD is that you have red, green, and refactor. So red is when you write your test knowing that it's going to fail. In other words, you expect it's going to fail because the functionality doesn't exist yet. So if you was to then run that test, you know it's going to fail, and hopefully it's an expected failure. The green part is when you start writing some application code to fulfill that test. So you've written your test, you then implement your MVP function, if you want to put it that way. And once that's written, you then go back to your test and run it, and hopefully it will pass. There's then the refactor stage. Now the refactor stage it could be one of two things. It can be growing the feature, so it's more feature rich, so adding more requirements and enriching the test some more. The other side of it is the application code that you've written, you'll refactor it to make it more succinct, to make it adhere to best practices, the solid principles and the dry principles and all of that stuff. And you can refactor your code, and you can do that with the confidence that you've got a test that will tell you if whatever you've done at the end of it has caused a regression. And that's the beauty of TDD. It's trying to give you that framework to work in. Once you've done your refactor and it passes again, you start the cycle all over again with your next requirement, your next feature. What we're going to build today. So I've tried my best to do a lab where we're not just taking noddy functions and just testing them in isolation. We're going to build a REST API, a HTTP REST API, and it's using Python, and it's using a web development framework called Flask. It's completely fine if you don't know either of those things. The objective of this playground is not to learn those two, it's to learn TDD. So you'll find that in the code base, a lot of boilerplate code has been written to support the Flask infrastructure for you. Typically, you wouldn't have that at the beginning of a project, but here we're going to make some assumptions that some things have been set up for you. What we're building is a stock market application, and what we're going to do is have some endpoints where we'll have a database with some stocks in them, and we'll have an endpoint where you can get all of those stocks. You can get a stock by a particular ticker symbol. We'll also have a feature where you can get a stock in a particular currency code that you're interested in. And then the last thing that we'll see what the order is, but then we'll also save a stock where you can add a new stock to the database. That's what we're building. But more importantly, we're going to be building that via TDD. So in other words, we're going to write tests first, we'll then write application to pass it, and we're going to do a mix of integration and unit tests. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the test pyramid, a unit test is essentially testing an individual component in isolation, and an integration test will be testing multiple components working together. We'll be doing a mix of those, and the reason why we're doing that is because the framework for Flask offers you the functionality to kind of test at an endpoint as well in a sort of test environment client kind of way. As I mentioned, certain functionality has been written to get over the Python Flask learning curve. The outcome, you'll have a working Flask application that meets the specified requirements. We'll have some integration and unit tests that we're writing as we go along, and it's part of the development process. Hopefully you'll enjoy yourselves and have a fun time. One of the things about TDD is that some people will say TDD is a QA activity. It's a testing activity. Some people will say it's a development activity. I lean to the latter. I think TDD is more of a development activity in the sense that it's not an afterthought after you've built your application. It's something that you do as you develop, and it's designed to help you think about what you're doing. I think it was Steve Jobs who said that the computer is an exercise bike for the mind. I think TDD is spin class for the mind. It's one of those things that can really focus your thinking. Cool. That's enough slides. Let's make a start. So I'm going to go to the README and we'll start there. So I believe there is a meetup link, which hopefully you visited already, and then there will be this link here, lab.devopsplayground.org, where you can get a username, and that will then give you access to an IDE that you can visit in the browser. Are people able to visit that link? Is anyone there already? At this point, feel free to put your hand up if you need a hand. It will be labs.devopsplayground.org. Lab, sorry, lab singular, .devopsplayground.org. And the password should be up there too. I'll try and zoom in if that helps to view the IDE link. Is that better? Can people see that now? Okay, let me try and zoom in some more. Is that better? Okay, so the IDE is once you've got this username, and the username can be found from labs.devopsplayground.org, you'll put your name in, you'll get a username and a password, and then you'll go to settling-panda. Beg your pardon?
As an input,
Yeah.
your meetup username, and that's the name that is displayed to public on your meetup.
Ah, apologies, sorry.
And that's the only thing we can know about you
Sure.
on meetup, using their IP.
Sure.
It is case sensitive, so I think on your screenshot, like if you go up a little, there should be a little. Yeah. So this is a meetup page, and if you click on your picture, view profile, the highlighted part is what you need.
What happens if somebody happens to attend the event after it started?
So what do you want your name to be?
You have to ask us nicely for
Yeah, if someone is not registered, that's not a problem. I can just rectify that very quickly. You need to provide me with a random string or not a random string, and that will be your username.
it can be your name.
Sorry?
Campbell.
Can you go back on the link?
The link, yeah, sure. Okay. I will see if I can help. Okay, what have you got? Lab singular, not labs. Yeah. Yeah, take out the S. Oh no, no. Yeah, well, yeah. Lab dot. Yeah. Have you got it now? Yeah. Okay. I believe it would be. So let's see. So they put DevOps. They put DevOps Playground in the field, do they?
No, they put their meetup
Their meetup name.
display name.
Yeah, your meetup display name if you have that. Okay,
But if they don't, we can add it.
sure. Were you added already?
So people should be added already.
Yeah.
If they haven't signed up to the meetup or signed up late and they can't get in, we can rectify that.
Okay.
Well, I got the notification that you joined, so
Your name in capital?
yours will be your team. Your team, name and teams.
It's always installation. That's the longest part.
Okay, I'm going to break the view.
Sure.
What's the name? Oh, sorry. Peter Campbell. He has just joined.
Are you fine with just Peter and capital?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay,
Tried with my username,
Yeah.
but it said user is not registered.
Did you register with that name in the meetup? You did.
If you didn't, that's fine. We will.
I'll let Patrick sort it out. Has anyone been able to access their IDE yet? Yeah? Okay, good, good. So it does work. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Anyone need a hand? Anyone struggling? Are we all good? Are we okay for me to move on? Is there anyone who needs a bit more time?
Funny enough, meetup happened to add a white space after some
Ah.
users.
Okay, that can cause problems too. All right, I'm guessing from the vibe I can move on. Cool, all right. Let me zoom out a bit. Cool, so you'll have an IDE and what I'd like you to do, I should have started from the very beginning, but you should have this test tube in the left-hand corner of your VS Code. Now, if you don't have that, that's okay. You're going to need to do a little bit of setup. What you do is that you go to Project, you'll go to Hands-on Test-Driven Development using Python, and under there, if you go to Test, and if you just click on a unit test like that, hopefully it will show up on your left-hand corner. And the directory is there if you want to look at it.
Can you expand it a bit?
As in this bit here?
No, it's a bit too.
Okay. Oh, the font you mean?
Yeah, that's fine.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So project hands-on, and then you should see this little test tube. I'm sorry, I've just remembered. The VS Code doesn't have the Python extension installed straight away. You'll need to do that first. Sorry, I forgot about that. So if you go to the little extension section, just search for Python, and you just want the Python extension, and you just click install. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. Once you have that, you can then try and click on that unit test, and hopefully the test tube will come up then. Now, once you do that, you won't get this tree straight away. It will ask you to configure some tests. And what you'll need to do, actually, let me delete my VS Code settings, and I'll see if I can start from scratch. There we go. Right. I refresh my browser. There we go. Cool, so click on unit test. I'll click on this. It will say configure Python tests. I'm going to click on configure, and I'm going to click on PyTest. That's the framework we're going to be using. And I'm going to click on project. Now, that's not going to work straight away, and the reason why is if I go back to the Explorer, it's generated my .vs code folder again. I'm going to go to settings, and the reason why that's not doing anything is because it's pointing at project. Now, the way that we set up this lab is that we have to kind of do a bit of manual config. So inside, on the test directory, I'm going to right click, I'm going to click on copy relative path. And then where you've got this PyTest args, I'm just going to replace the contents of that and do that instead. And then, hopefully when you click on the test tube now, you should see that tree. The other thing to check, I didn't get this problem, although sometimes on startup it can happen. You want to check that you're using the right version of Python, which is 3.11. And if you're not, you just do Control-Shift or Command-Shift-P to bring up the menu. Just click Select Interpreter, and then just make sure you have Python 3.11 configured as well.
Where did you put
The directory under .vs code in the settings.json file. So this should be auto-generated for you by the IDE. Have people been able to get some success there? Okay, so let me have a look. I'll come around this way. So, can I, yeah, just, you don't have the .vs code. You have 3.11, so if you then click on test,
We went into that.
unit test, maybe try refreshing your browser. Hopefully it will turn up. Interesting. It's interesting that you don't have that. So, configure. Yep. Yep. Get back here. Yep, there you go. You've got it now. Okay. Yep. So, click on project. Yeah. And then if you... so you don't have your .vs code yet. So if you click on... okay. And then click on configure Python test and then PyTest, and then in there click project. There you go. PyTest, correct. Yeah. And then if you go back to your file system, you should see the .vs code directory. You do. Okay.
What's the extension name?
Extension of what?
Python extension of resistance.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Sorry.
The first question was, I don't see auto-generated VS Code, which
Okay.
you described. And the follow-up question was, what's the extension name?
Oh, sorry, Python. It's just called Python. Yeah, sorry, I get it now. So I'll go through those instructions again. So you're clicking on the configure test, so I'll delete it again and try and do it again. Right. So you want to click on configure Python tests, PyTest, project. Once you do that, it will auto-generate that .vs code directory. And in there, you're just replacing project with the relative path to your test directory, which should be that. Once you do that, this is what you should get, like a test tree similar to this. Has anyone been able to achieve that? Yeah? No, not yet? No? We'll give it a little bit more time. Oh, have I lost it? I don't know what's happened, but there.
So configure Python test, PyTest, and then project?
Yes. That's weird. Something's just happened to my Patrick. Could I borrow you? It appears, I don't know if, is my ID, am I the only one with access to this particular IDE?
You should be, unless someone typed your name. You're on Funny Panda, that's not your panda.
Ah, should I be in, is there a different one?
Yeah, if you go to your lab and type Chris, that will be
Oh,
panda.
I forgot to do it myself. Sorry. Let me go and do that now. I was using the one that was given to me on the,
Yeah, that might be someone else, isn't it?
yeah, so laptop, this one?
Yeah, that's the one.
So I've already used Chris G.
The capital.
Just like that?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry.
And you should get something if you scroll down. Yeah, so you're sweet panda, not funny. You're not funny.
I
you're
was
just
using,
sweet.
sorry, I was using the wrong one. Right, let me just do that again. Cool. Okay. Okay.
the version of Python make any difference to the TDD test?
It will, not to the test code itself, but in terms of finding the right test, you may get some errors. So I encourage you to use 311, which is already there. Yeah. And just, I can show you, do you want me to show you the interpreter selection again, or? Okay, fine. Right. Sure. The test won't, for obvious reasons, the test will not run. Yeah. I hope that's obvious enough, but yeah. Right. Are we all there? There's one guy who's still doing it. No? Okay. Do you need some help?
I copy
That's not the right directory.
this one, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So right click, copy relative path.
But it's pasting the same thing.
And when I paste it, it's the first one. I don't know.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And you're in the right place. That's different to what I've got.
Yeah. That's why it's there.
You can type it in manually then. You can just do projects.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can just type it in manually. Yeah. Hey, mate.
So I added this, I don't know what this thing doesn't disappear anymore.
So click on PyTest. PyTest. Sorry, you clicked on the wrong one. So press escape. There you go.
Anyway, so I put this here.
Yeah. Project hands-on. That looks correct, yes. Yeah, and then if you click on the test tube, can you see your project? Configure Python tests. Click on PyTest. Project. Right, that's going to get overwritten. Because you've put unit test args there. So what I would encourage you to do is delete that VS Code. You can just delete the VS Code directory and try again. Yeah, you're going to get that error. So if you go back to your file system, delete the .vs Code directory, and we can just do it again. Delete permanently
Where is the?
at the bottom.
Oh,
Yeah. Yep.
is there another kind of thing? I guess. Yeah.
Yep. So now, if you click on the test tube again. Yep. If you refresh your browser for a minute, or refresh this page. Let's see if that. All right, let's try it again. Now, if you click on unit test, click on test unit.
Which?
Test unit.py. Well, yeah, that'll do. No, that's fine. And if you click on the test tube, configure Python tests, PyTest project. Right, now if you click on the file system again. Yes, so on .vs Code, yep, settings. You want to replace this string with the test directory in that, yeah. So right click, copy relative path, paste it there. Yep, save. Oh, I think it saves it for you. And then if you click on the test tube now, there, you've got it. Cool, that's it. It's there. Yeah, so there's your test tree. Yeah. Okay. Is there anyone has anyone not set it up? One more. Sorry. How can I help?
Showing some error discovery bypass.
What's the error that you're getting? Okay. Let's see. Control Shift P. Interpreter. Select Python interpreter. Let's see if you have your Python set up properly. You do, yes. There you go. It was just your Python version. Okay. Right. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's quickly just explore this project a bit. So I'm going to go into the file system, and there's a project directory, and in there is hands-on test-driven development. Let's have a quick look at what we're working with. We have an app folder. And inside app, I'm just going to open up what that looks like. There's some commented code, but this is where the Flask application code is going to sit.
Can you expand it a bit?
Yeah, sure. Is that better?
That's right.
So that's where the code is going to sit. There's some imports in there that imports the Flask library, and then there's a reference to app, which will be used. It's a web development framework, so it's defining some endpoints as well, which is what we're going to use, and there's some stub code in there to begin with. We also have a components folder. These are basically helper functions, and the bulk of our unit tests are going to sit here. So we've got one for get all stocks, we've got one for get stock by ticker. Some of the boilerplate code has been implemented already, but most of it's been commented out, which we'll get into later. We've got a model So I was debating if we should write this out ourselves or if I should just give it to you. I've chosen to give it to you because it's hopefully fairly trivial. It's a stock class which defines the attributes, which will be the analyst, the ticker symbol, the name of the stock, and the prices. And the prices will be what we call a list or an array of key value pairs. For those of you who've done Java, you might call that a hash map, but it's essentially key value pairs data structure. In Python, it will just be a list of dictionaries, but that's what we're doing here. Now the DB, it's not strictly speaking a DB, it's a JSON file which contains our stock. So if we go into that structure, with that stock model that I've just described, there's the name, a ticker symbol, an analyst, and then the prices, which is our list of key value pairs. And there's 3 stocks in there. There's Global Logic. We're not publicly traded, but why not? Microsoft, and there's one for Apple in there as well. But it follows the same structure. Now, if we go to our tests, we have some unit tests and we have some integration tests. So if we open up the unit test file, we've got some variables which point to where to find the DB, and we'll get to that near to the end. But for now, you can just leave that as is. And then one component has almost been written for you that you can use, test, and we're going to implement that in a minute. And the rest is commented. You'll have some teardown code. For those of you familiar with unit test frameworks, you'll have a teardown functionality which can perform an action once a unit test is finished. So Python has that as well. So you shouldn't need to touch this, but if you get problems, we'll solve it. And this is just used for restoring the original DB. We have some integration tests, which will use Flask to develop a fake client that we'll use to make calls to, another teardown method, and you can see here that we're making calls, rather than to a function, we're making calls to endpoints, and we'll be elaborating on that later on when we implement the function. Anything else? There's blanked examples and worked examples. You don't really need to go into here, but you can go into the worked examples for reference, but the README will also help you with that too. Any questions or comments? Okay, let's make a start. Let's go into test_unit, which can be found in the test directory. So hands-on TDD, and then we've got the test directory. And the first piece of functionality we want to develop is we want a function that is going to get all the stocks. And what this is going to do is that it's going to take everything that's in that database, that JSON file that we looked at earlier, which I'll bring up again. We want to take everything in here, and what we want to do is serve that up to the user. And we want to do this as a list of stock objects. Hopefully we're all familiar with some aspects of OOP, but an object is essentially just a data structure that can be conceptualized. So it's going to return a list of stock objects. So let's write a test that will describe the behavior of that. So this test has partially been written for you. It's going to get all the stocks. It's going to call a function called getAllStocks, and it returns a variable called stocks. A very simple test that we can do to show that there's some kind of functionality here is we can test the length of the list that we get back. Who can tell me what the length of the list would be? It's in the DB. How many stocks are there? There's 3.
3,
Yeah? So we would expect that if we call this getAllStocks function, we would expect a length of 3 elements to come back. So what we can do in the README, which I very silly navigated away from, here we go. So in the README, if we go down, we've done this bit. Yeah, we've done all that. Yeah, so I'm just zooming in a bit. So this is where we are right now in step 1. So in the README, we're just going to do an assertion where we get the length, which is the len keyword, and we're going to check that it's equal to 3. So you can copy that into this test, which I will go to. Okay, and that's a very simple test that we can do. The other thing that we'll need to do is, oh, I jumped ahead, but if we run that test, so if we go back to our testing, our test tube, if we go to, if we expand the unit test tree, you can see that there's a test called test get all stocks, and this hollow circle just represents it hasn't been run yet. Now if I run that test, it's going to fail, and it's going to tell me that get all stocks is not defined. Is everyone getting that error? Cool. And the reason why we're getting that error is because we haven't imported it. So the way that you fix that is we're just going to add an import from app.components import get all stocks to the top of that test file, which is uncommented here. When you do that, it's going to find the get all stocks function inside components. Now, strictly speaking, that is a red test, but that's a fairly noddy red test. But it's just to get you warmed up. If I run that now, we're going to get a different error. And it says none type has no len. In other words, you're trying to do a length on a none object, which obviously doesn't work. So now, what we're going to do is implement the get all stocks function to pass this very basic test. So if I go into here, oh, by the way, for those of you unfamiliar with the IDE, let me go back. If you want to just drill down into an existing function, you press Control, or I'm using a Mac, so I'll do Command. That will highlight, and you just click on it, and it will take you there. If that fails, you can just always go to the file structure and do it that way. So now I'm in app and components.py. So that's where I am right now. So we've got some code in here already, and what this is doing, it's opening the database file, and db path is being defined here, and that's the path of that JSON file we looked at earlier. And it's going to load the contents of that JSON file into a variable called stocks.json. That's what it's doing. And if we go down, we're going to look at how to implement that. And all we need to do is return stocks.json. That's all we're doing. So if I copy that line and put it in, that's what we get. And if I hit run, that test now passes. And that's all it's really doing. And if you want to stick a breakpoint in there and see what's going on, I'm going to click run. Oh, it does it for me. Stocks.json is simply a list of dictionaries, Python dictionaries. That's all it's doing there. And the length is free. Is that clear to everyone? Yep. Fairly straightforward. I'm going to stop the debug there. Now, if you remember, one of the things that I said earlier is that we want to return a list of stock objects. So we're getting a list coming back, but how do we know that we're getting stock objects in there? What can we do to test that? So one of the things that we can do is go back to our test. This is rather large. I'll shut this down for now. Right. And if we go to the README again, that passes. What we'll do now is we're going to add this assertion here. Now, we know we're getting a list of stock objects, or at least we think we're getting that. We could get the first element of that stock object, and we can invoke one of the properties inside that stock object. Now, if you remember from the model, one of those attributes is analyst. So we would expect to get the analyst from that stock object. So what we're going to do is copy that in, and we're going to put that in our unit test. That's another assertion that we can do. And the reason why I put Warren Buffett is because, other than him being a pretty damn good investor, is that we know that he's put down as one of the analysts for this particular stock. So we're expecting the first element to be Global Logic, and the analyst would be Warren Buffett. That's why we picked that particular name. Now, if I run that test, it's going to fail. And the reason why it fails is because it's saying that a dictionary doesn't have an attribute called analyst. And that makes sense because a standard Python dictionary wouldn't have that. And so we're going to now look into our code and understand why are we not getting back a stock object. It seems to be returning dictionaries, a list of dictionaries, rather than a list of stocks. So we'll go back to our code. And we're not doing anything in our code that converts those dictionaries into stock objects. That's why we're getting this error. So we're going to implement some code to do that. So if we go back to the README, we're going to implement what's basically a Lambda function that's going to go through each of our elements and convert it to a stock. And you can see it's using the stock keyword, which is that model that we defined earlier. So if you're unfamiliar with Lambdas, it's almost like you can say it's looping through a particular data structure, and then we're using the map function to apply some kind of transformation to it.
Why did we have to use the lambda function anyway?
It's a nice one-liner, rather than writing a for loop. Yeah, you can do a for loop if you wish. I personally prefer to write fewer lines of code than more, unless there's a good reason. But that's personally why I choose to do lambdas. There is, if you're more comfortable, if you think that a for loop is more readable, then fine, by all means, go for it. So this is giving you the lambda function, and it returns stocks list obj. So let's change our return function to reflect that. And I'm just checking in the README if there's anything else we need to do. Right, that's it. So if I run that test now, it will pass. And if we stick a break, we've got our breakpoint already. So if we run that in our debug mode and inspect it now, before we were getting a list of dictionaries from the final variable. Now we're getting a list of stock objects. Does that make sense? So that, by what we've done there, just to backtrack a bit, we wrote a test. It was red. We wrote some code to make it green, and then we did some refactoring. So we added another assertion to prove another piece of functionality. It failed again, and then we went back around and we implemented some new functionality to make the test pass again. Does that make sense? Cool. Right. Am I okay to move on? Does anyone need any help? Yeah? Sorry, was that a hand? Oh, that was a hand. Okay. How can I help?
Yeah, I have done this one here, but what needs to be done in this one or another one?
So you'll need to uncomment this line of code to import the stock. So uncomment that. Yep. Well, and it's indented. So press, yeah, just make it on the same line. That's it. Save, yeah, and then if you go to components, you've got it open already. You need to, yeah, make sure that stock list object is just outside. I should probably mention that Python is indented. And then you need to return it. So if you, on the next line, if you do return stock list obj, make sure it's on the same line. It's the same indent as, yeah, it's got to be in line. Press tab. Tab? Yep. And then return stock list obj. Stock underscore list underscore obj. That's it. If you try running your test again now, does it pass?
This one?
Yep. Yep. And if you try, so go to test unit. Yep. Expand that. Stock. Yeah. Expand that, and run that test. So press the triangle. Yep. Well, this one. Yep. Okay. You're getting an error, and the error is. Yep. You've done that. Okay. Stocks is not defined. Why is stocks not defined? Stocks, get all stocks, lens stocks. Yep, you've done that properly. And then stocks. Ah, it's stocks list. There we go. There we go. If you try and run that.
It's always a typo, right?
does appear to be more than one typo now, so let's have another look. Stocks underscore list underscore obj stocks. Ah, I know, it's stocks JSON underscore JSON. There you go. Yeah. Okay, does that pass? Cool, there you go. All right, you're welcome. Okay, let's...
I got one more from you from online. I
Sure.
can shout it for you,
Yeah.
on you. Oh wait, I have a tool for that. Would it be more useful to check the object that object contains attribute called analyst rather than looking for a specific value?
That the object contains analyst. You could do it that way too. I've given an assertion, but you can check that the attribute analyst exists as well. What I've done is if you check that it's existing by checking for a particular name by invoking the analyst property. So I think whoever asked that question raises a good point. You could do it that way too. There are other assertions you could do. You could do a list. You could check that the entire list of stock objects and check every single one. You could read the DB independently, convert them to stock objects, and check that it matches what you get back in return. There's more than one way to slice this. Yes?
There's a way to define what type a function returns.
In Python, not really.
Not really.
You can suggest types, but Python doesn't tie you down to types, so it's not like Java or C#.
So you won't get errors, essentially.
You can get errors, and
Okay.
as a Python dev, I've scratched my head multiple times only to realize that it's the wrong type that I'm expecting. But yeah, Python doesn't out of the box give you a way of enforcing types.
Right.
And I've tried to read up on this, but yeah.
Is it because it's a passive language, that's why?
Is it because of?
Because it's a non-compiled language.
Yeah, I think that's probably why. Yeah. Right, cool. Let's move on. So we've done that. The next thing is we're going to implement an integration test. So what we're going to do is we've written a helper function. We're going to associate that function with a root so that when you try to access that endpoint over the web, that function will be called and do something. So what we're going to do is in app, we're going to go to app.py. And we've got this get all stocks function, which is being run here. And what this is doing is that we're binding a root to stock/all stocks. And it's going to call get all stocks here. And then using the JSONify command, it converts it into JSON, which will then be served up in the response. So that's what's going on here. This has pretty much been implemented for you just to kind of get you into this. And then we're now going to run an integration test. So if we go to test_int, this is an example of an integration test. It's calling the endpoint, and then it's getting a status code of 200. Now if I run that, it should pass straight away. Now, it's a fairly simple test. It's not really proving too much. Now there is some argument to say if you've asserted the length of the stocks or that you're getting stock objects in your helper function, should you be doing it here? I'm of the opinion that we shouldn't really be repeating ourselves, so I'm going to leave it as a 200 for now, but there'll be other integration tests where we do some other kinds of assertions. But this is just an example of where you can move up and down the test pyramid to test certain aspects of your code, depending on what you want to do. So yeah, that was just an example of that. And then, yep, that's fine. We've covered this. Test will pass. So test get all stocks. Yep, we've done that too. I think we have. Oh, well, sorry. You could assert the length here as well. So we can do that here. So I'm going to use, I'll show you what I'm doing here. So what I'm doing here is I'm getting the response object, and a response object is a Flask object that gives you the entire response. We're getting the JSON from that response, and then we're asserting that the length of that is free. And that's what I've done here. So it's pretty similar to what we did at the helper level. And that passes. One of the things that I should have mentioned at the beginning, for those who are unfamiliar with Python, is that Python is an indented language. So when you write a function, or when you write any code, these indents, the gaps between the beginning of the line and where you are, they matter, and they basically represent layers of nesting that you can do. So if you do something like this, you will get errors. So just bear that in mind when you're doing it. And you can easily indent by just using tab or space as well.
Just like C.
Yeah, I guess. It's been a while since I've done C, but yeah. Right, let's move on. What we're now going to do is the next part of our functionality, which is we're going to get stock by a ticker. So if I go back to the database, you can see that each stock has a ticker symbol. GL, MSFT for Microsoft, and APPL for Apple. What we want to do is we want to implement an endpoint where we pass in one of those ticker symbols, and rather than getting the entire list of stocks, we just get back that one particular stock instead. So we're going to implement some functionality to do that. So in the unit tests, we're going to comment out this piece of code here. You can see there's not really a lot of implemented code here. But we're going to write a test that will check that we get back that stock. So what we can do, let's think about how we know that this works. We want to call the function, and that function will give us back a stock object. And in that object, we can assert certain things. Namely, we can assert that the ticker symbol is what we expect it to be. And if we don't get that particular ticker symbol, we know that something's gone wrong. So in the README, this is a very simple test that we can do. I'm going to paste that in. And what this is doing is we're using the getStockByTicker function. We're going to pass in MSFT. What we're expecting is that the stock.ticker symbol will equal MSFT, and just for good measure, we're going to check the name of that stock as well. Okay. If I run that test, you can see, by the way, that now that we've uncommented that test, you can see that we get a new entry in our test tree, unimplemented. If I hit play, that will fail. And the reason being is because getStockByTicker is not defined. So as per the README, we're going to import getStockByTicker to our existing list of imports. Oh, I've done it twice. Apologies. There we go. And then we should get a new error after that. And we're getting a none type, which is what we saw before. And this is most likely because the function has not been implemented. So this is some stub code that we've written before. It's reading the database, but now what we've got to do is figure out how we find the stock that we're interested in and fish that out of the list of entries that we've got so far. So that's the part of functionality we're going to do. So yeah, that's what we're getting. And then what we're going to do is implement some more lambdas. The first one is just going to convert the list of stocks into stock objects. So we've seen that before already. And then the next thing we're going to do is copy this. Now what this is doing is that it's a lambda function that will go through each stock, look at the ticker symbol, and it will check that it's equal to the ticker symbol that we put into the function. And then it's performing a filter operation, so it fishes that out, and it will convert all the entries into a list. And it's doing that on stock list obj, which was read in from the previous lambda function. And then, as per the README, what we're going to do is we're going to return the first result that we get back. Because remember that we still get a list coming back, so we get the first result. Now if we run that, that will pass. And I'm going to stick a breakpoint on that and show you what's going on. So stock list object is what we've seen before, which was a list of stocks. And then stock list match is a one-element list which contains our stock. And if we crack that open, we get Microsoft and we get MSFT as our ticker symbol. Has everyone been able to do that? Yep. Good. So slightly more complex. So the next part that we're going to do, we'll do a refactor now. So we did a red, it failed. We did a green, we got the test to pass. Let's do a refactor. So let's look at this code. Hopefully you've noticed that we've repeated some code from get all stocks. We've read this database, and then we've converted it to a list of stocks, but we've done the same thing here as well. Sorry, was there a question? Oh, okay, cool, right. So there's a list of stocks here, and we've basically just repeated the code. What we're going to do is refactor get stock by ticker to use get all stocks, because the functionality is already there, and it's doing what we want to accomplish with these 3 lines of code. So in the README, you'll see yes, what we've done is I'm going to copy this line here, and I'm going to replace the opening and the stock conversion with that line. And that's a refactor that we've just done. And if I run a test for that, I'm expecting this to pass. And it does. So what we've done is, by having a test in place first, I can change code, and I don't have to worry about whether or not it's going to work, because the test will tell me that for me. And so if I change the code and it broke, that test is going to tell me something. And it's going to say, look, I don't know what you've done just now, but whatever you've done, you're not meeting functional business requirements at the moment. So you need to go back and change that to make it work. And so that's the beauty of having those tests as you go along with your test-driven development. And the other thing that you can do is, in the test tree, I'm going to go to the test section. If I run both of those tests, it runs. So that's another layer of regression testing, which means that not only have I continued to pass that one test, but all the other tests are passing as well. So it gives you that assurance that you're not breaking stuff as you go along. And that's a key concept of a test-first approach. Any questions or comments about that?
The issue I have is, if you're having an application, especially a script application like Python sitting on the JVM, and has to connect to external sources, how do you ensure that TDD works with testing with an external source?
So you mean like if you're...
Sorry. Let me give you an example.
Sure.
Okay, the front-end development is fine with TDD, no problems, okay? Now, you have to connect up to the database externally.
Right.
With the data collected from the front-end systems.
Right.
How does TDD ensure that the passing of those data is accurate and effective to a relational, especially a relational system at the back end?
Okay, so for those online, if I understand your question properly, it's how do you ensure that TDD works when you're dealing with back-end systems?
Yeah, back-end systems, yeah.
Okay, so there's a number of approaches to that. You'll notice so far that we haven't done any mocking. That's because TDD doesn't necessarily associate itself with mocking. That's more of a unit testing practice. My personal approach is that if I have access to a dev DB that I'm allowed to talk to, I will write my tests to that DB and get the data there, and then I will mock afterwards once I know it does what I want it to do. So you could do that, but then in that process, that's how you know that your tests are working against that database. And then hopefully you're running it in a pipeline as well, so then you can do that too. In terms of does it run with a back-end system, that might be more of a question that can be answered by BDD rather than TDD, in the sense that you're writing acceptance tests that will make calls to a back-end system. At a unit testing level, it's generally advised that you're supposed to mock external calls that you make to a system. We're not going to be doing mocking here because, one, it's just simpler, and two, I don't want people to think that TDD must mean you have to mock. It's a unit testing practice, in my opinion. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much.
Cool. All right.
It's been a long-standing issue we have within.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Right, so what we've done so far is that we've passed that test to get our stock that matches our ticker symbol. And we've done a bit of refactoring to reduce the code. Next thing you do is we're going to associate that with a root, as we did with get all stocks. So I want you to go to your app file. So I'm going to go to the file system. I'm going to go to app.py. And we're going to look for, should be this one here. Yes, so it's at the top. I'm going to uncomment this block of code. There is an extra layer of commenting there, so just leave that for now. We will address that later on. But for the time being, we've just uncommented this root, and you can tell it's trying to JSONify stock and then pass it to a dictionary. If I run this test, I'm just checking that I don't need to do anything else before that. Yep. So if I run this test, is it going to pass or is it going to fail? Is the silence I don't know? Fair enough. Okay. So which test is that? I've just opened up the app file, so I haven't done anything with the test just yet. All I've done is gone to app and I've uncommented. If you're using the same line numbers as me, line 8, which is stock / ticker symbol. And then the next thing I need to do, I need to, yeah, we've done that bit. We need to import the stock into our integration test, I believe. So if we go to test int, we're going to uncomment this block here from line 35 in our test_int file. And then what we need to make sure that we do is import, oh, we've done the import already, sorry, beg your pardon. So this integration test will make a call to that endpoint, and we passed in APPL, Apple, that's the ticker symbol. And then our JSON response, we expect, we convert this to a stock using the **, the keyword argument, and then we get the ticker symbol to check that it's Apple. I'm going to run that test. Hopefully it turns up. There it is. That will fail. And that's because it's saying that the name stock is not defined, which makes sense because if we look at what's going on in app.py, you'll notice that the function is not being called at all yet. It's looking for this variable called stock, and it hasn't been defined. So we're going to call the function that we're testing, stock by ticker symbol. So in the README, if you go down, it should be, I think I've gone a bit too far, so let me go up a bit, sorry. Oh, I may have missed something in the README, in which case that's fine, we can implement that. Okay, fine. What we'll do, I may have missed something in the README, so apologies. So what I will do is I'm going to paste this in, but rather than Tesla, we're just going to put in, yeah, what we'll do, we're just going to put in ticker symbol instead, and that should pass. If I run that now, oh, still fails. So if we look at why that fails, peak error, get stock by ticker is not defined. Have I imported it? No, I haven't. So under app.components, I'm just going to do a comma and then get stock by ticker to import it. And if I run that, that will pass now. So what we've done there is that we've associated the function with a root, and then in our integration test, we're proving that the JSON response is the stock object that we think it should be. And by doing this conversion, we're proving that we get back a JSON response that matches the stock model, and that we're proving that the ticker symbol is what we expect it to be as well. You could probably think of your own assertions that you wanted to do as well in here, and depending on how in-depth you want to be. But for the time being, I think that's a pretty good assertion that we can do. So we'll move on to the next one. What happens when you pass a ticker symbol that doesn't exist in the database? How would it behave? So we've got, if we go back to our unit test cases, excuse me, there we go. We've got a test here on line 28, if you're following the same line numbers as me, called test invalid stock not found, and that's in the unit test file, test_unit. I'm going to uncomment that, and according to what we want it to do, when you pass in a bad stock, i.e. a stock that doesn't exist, in this case Tesla, we're expecting none to be returned. That's what we want it to do. So if I go to my test tube and if my newly minted test is here, if I run that, that's the red stage, it's failed, and it's giving us this list index out of range error. So we're not getting none, the code's just crashing out at this point. So let's try to fix that. I'm going to go back to get stock ticker, and we're going to figure out how to handle this exception and instead return none. So if we go to the README, what we're going to do is we're going to do a check to see what the length of the stock list is, and then based on that we'll perform an action. So we're going to return none. So I'm going to copy this, and then after we've done the filter, we're going to check the length of what we get back. If the length is 0, that's telling us that we're not getting anything back from the database. We're getting an empty list, and therefore we're going to return none instead of trying to return the index of a list, and that's why we're getting that error. If I run that, that passes. Everyone able to do that so far? Nope. Let's see how I can help.
Passing some tests, it's not passing some tests.
Okay, so you've got an error discovering test, so you need to address this first. You've got an indentation error, so that's in ticker symbol MSFT. So if we go to your ticker symbol test, you've got an indent error here. So you see that little line on line 22? Yeah, so if you click on line 22, and go back, hopefully that will get rid of that error. Yes, it does. And then, try and run that. There you go. Yeah, you can do that.
This one invalid stock not found.
Yeah, so if you run that test. Okay. So that try that that statement that I've just implemented, you need to implement that block of code. Okay. Great. So we've implemented that piece of functionality. What we're going to do now is we're going to put that into an integration test. So if I go back to the integration tests, I'm going to go to test_int. We've got a commented block of code here called get stock by bad ticker. So I'm going to uncomment that. And it's pretty similar to what's going on here. We're using the same functionality, but this time we're expecting a different kind of behavior. And the behavior that we expect, we still want it to give a 200 response. We're not expecting a 400 or 404. You could argue if you wanted to get a 400, if that's the right response, but I'll let you determine that in your design. But then we're expecting the JSON property to be none. That's what we want. So I'm going to take these two assertions, and I'm going to paste that here. And that's what we're expecting. If we run that test, it's going to error, I believe. And it says object has no attribute dict, so which we're expecting. And the reason why is because we're not handling that none object yet. So if I go back to app, it's trying to take a none object, which is rightfully being returned as none, but it's trying to convert that into a Python dictionary, and it's erroring there because it doesn't know how to convert none into a dictionary. So we need to fix that to get the right response. And so this is the commented if block that I've got here. I'm going to uncomment that now. I'm going to indent to if stock, and I'm also going to uncomment the else statement there. So if stock, which is basically saying if stock is not none in Python, to be more explicit, you could say if stock exclamation mark equals, none, to say not none, then do this action, else return something else. So that's what we're doing here. We're going to, if we are getting a valid stock, it's going to convert it to JSON and return that. Else it's going to convert none to JSON, which is essentially the same thing as none, and return that instead. If I run that, that passes. Yes?
Can't you just put stock instead of none there?
Can I put, say that, sorry, could we get a microphone, sorry? I didn't quite hear you. Oh, okay.
Isn't stock none on the else branch? So you can replace none with just stock?
You could.
Just
I just chose to be explicit.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, you could do that. But yeah, you could if you wanted to. I just chose to be explicit about it, that's all. Cool.
So what happens if you just on the regular, on the true branch, why do you need to do the dicts?
So the question is, why do I need to use this dict function here? Remember that you're getting back a stock object, but when you're serving that up to a REST endpoint, it needs to be converted into JSON.
But doesn't JSONify do that?
Not quite. No, you have
so
to
you need
tell
to
it
do
to
it.
use a dictionary.
Right, okay.
I did try it with just stock before, and it gave me errors. So after googling, that's what I found. Yeah.
All right. Thank
So
you.
that's what I found. Cool. Okay. Right. Let's move on. So we've done this piece and the test passes. Let's do something a little bit more complex now. We've been able to get all of our stocks. We can get a stock by a particular ticker symbol. Let's implement some functionality to save a stock, where we can pass a new stock to the database and get it updated. So we're going to go back to our unit tests. In our file system, we're going to go to test unit. We have a block of code here called test save stock success. I'm going to uncomment that. Now, what we're seeing here is it's making a reference to test stock. Test stock is a variable defined at the top of the file, and it's going to I believe that's incorrect. I'll need to change that. Yes, that is. Okay, fine, that can be fixed. So what I will do, you'll need to do this on your side too. So under test, there is a folder called test data. And in here, there's a file called stock.test.json. Now, if we open that, there is one stock in here. It's a new stock from Hitachi. There's some stub prices in there. And the objective of our test is that we're going to read this and upload that to our database. Although I realize there's a mistake in the code. So what I'm going to do is right-click. I'm going to do copy relative path. And back in the unit test, where it says test stock, I'm just going to replace it with what I've just copied. So you should have this instead, test data / stock test JSON, and it's assigned to the test stock variable. Apologies about that. Have we sorted that? Yes? No? Yep. It's not passing. What, this one, because we haven't run the test yet, or was it a previous test? The one before? Okay. Let's have a look.
I implemented the if statement also, but it's not passing.
You can voice the concerns to the word.
Sure. So yeah, someone's test is not passing, so the error that you're getting. Oh. Set stock is equal to none, and the reason why you're getting that is because name stocks _ JSON is not defined. Okay. Sorry. Could you click for me, if you don't mind? There we go. Stock list match. If stock list match is equal to 0, return stocks list. What is stocks JSON? I believe that should be stock list obj. Yeah.
This one.
Yeah. So, okay. So this needs to be stocks JSON. So you've written the same variable twice. There you go. Yeah. And then, yeah, stocks JSON. Okay. So if you run that, okay, do you get a new error? Okay. Yeah, this is a different error now. Must be a mapping, not a stock. So let's see what's going on there. Okay. Oh, get out the way. There we go. Stock list object. So that's mapping it to a stock, and then stock list object filter. So where does it fail? What line? Yeah. Peak error, and then stock list by ticker. Okay, so it fails when you try to do that on stocks JSON. So, oh, thanks. Sorry. Yeah. Stocks JSON. Get all stocks. So if you stick a breakpoint here. Okay. So that's correct, I think. Yes. If we stick a next breakpoint there. Yep. Okay, so it failed there. Have you implemented stocks JSON? So that's correct. This is stock. Yep. Yeah, you can. And what have you done? Let's go to the README. Do you have the README? Is that it? Yeah.
This one.
Oh, this one. Okay, sure. And then get stock by ticker. Was it this one that we were doing?
Yes. And you have done after that also.
Bad integration. Yeah. So I think there's something bigger going on here.
You've got a little copy button in the right corner.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. We can skip ahead and we can just do this then. Oh, I see what's happened. You haven't deleted a line that was being replaced. Right, okay, that should work now. There we go. Okay, cool. All right, cool. Let's move on. So just finding my bearings again. Let's get back here. Oh yes, we did the integrations test. We're going to save a stock. So if we go back to our unit tests. So what we're doing here is we're reading in that test stock, and now we're going to do something with it. We're going to convert it to a stock object, and then what we're going to do is use our add stock function to update the database. So if we go to the next part, this is essentially the code we're going to run. So I'm going to copy this block in. And just to be clear, this is the function we're going to run. We're going to save the stock, and then we're going to run get all stocks. And our database has 3 stocks. If we add a stock, we expect the length to be 4. So a basic test that we can do is check that the length is 4. So that's enough to get us started for the time being. Don't forget, you need to import your save stock function as well. So I'm going to copy that into unit testing, and I'm just going to add that to our list of imports. So hopefully that should make things a bit better. And then if we run that, what error do we get? Oh, do I have an error somewhere else? Let me check. I think I may have copied it wrong, so let me check what we've got. Oh, yes. Okay, fine. So if we go to our components, save stock doesn't exist. So what I need to do is where we've got this method called save stock, I'm just going to uncomment it once. There is a block of code that's still commented here, but don't worry about that for now. But I'm just going to uncomment this. I'm aware that some of this has been developed already, and typically in TDD that wouldn't happen. But just to make things a bit easier, I've implemented some of the code for you. But it should still fail. Oh, it passed, sorry. It should pass. And if we look at our database, what you will notice is that you will not see the entry in there. And the reason being is because we have a teardown function that removes it afterwards, so that if you run the test again, it will pass again. So what we can do to prove that it's there, even though we know that the test passed, is in our unit test, before we run the teardown, I'm just going to put a breakpoint on the assertion. And then what I'm going to do is run it again, but this time in debug mode. So I'm going to click on debug. And if we go to the file now, you can see that the stock is there. And if I let the debug continue after that, it's going to take it away. If I go back, it's gone. Oh, sorry, there's another line. There we go. And it gets taken away. And so the reason why we do this is so that it just cleans the database afterwards, so that if you run it again, you're not going to get the same stock entered into the database multiple times. Does that make sense? Cool. So now what we're going to do is, I believe we're going to associate this with a root. Yep. Yeah, we've done that bit. Ah, sorry, I forgot. We've only just checked the length of the list. Let's do something a bit more meaningful. Let's get the length. Let's get that particular stock and prove that our entry is in the database. So we expect the fourth entry in our database to be the stock that we uploaded. So if we did assert, if we assert stocks, and if we get the fourth element and it's 0 index, so we're going to say free. And if we say get the ticker symbol, and then if we go back to our test data, which is in stock test JSON, we expect the ticker symbol to be the Hitachi ticker symbol. I believe that's the correct one. And then we expect it to be equal to that. Oh, sorry. There we go. We expect it to be equal to that. And that is another way of proving that the database has been updated with our new entry. And have I put an error in my code? Ah, yes. Thank you. There you go. That should go away. Right. And that should already pass, I believe. Test tree. There we go. Save stocks. And that passes again. And you can rerun your test tree if you want as well to make sure that everything else passes. So there's some proof that it's doing what we expect it to do from there. Next part, I believe we're going to associate it with a root, which is an integration test. So what we're going to do is in our integration tests, there is a test called test add stock integration. I'm going to uncomment that block of code. May need a little bit of indenting, so I'm going to, sorry, there we go. Should look like that because it's indented. We're opening the test doc. We're converting it into some JSON, and then what we need to do is call the endpoint to add the stock. And the way that we do that is in our README. If I go down a bit, this is the block of code we're going to use. And that's going to call the add stock endpoint, and then we're using the data keyword in the method in the function signature, and we're going to pass our JSON to it. So this is part of a client post request essentially, and we're just passing our JSON as a payload to this endpoint. And we then need an assertion. How do we know that it's doing something good? And in this particular case, we're just going to give it a simple 200 response to get us started. And yeah, that will just prove that we're getting a 200 response when we do the post request. And if I go to my newly minted test, that will fail. And we're getting a 404 instead of a 200. That's usually a sign that it can't find the endpoint that we're specifying. So if we go to our app, unsurprisingly, the reason why we're getting a 404 is because that route doesn't exist yet. So we're going to uncomment that. And there's still some commented code in there which we'll get to later. But in here, we're calling save stock, and we're passing in from the request the JSON. And then we'll get a response, and then we return a response. But yeah, for the time being, let's just focus on getting our 200 for now. And then make sure that you import your save stock as well.
Excuse me. The post, just look at the code over the app route, okay, and it goes post.
Yes.
Normally, the 404 responses normally we get, not post. How? I don't understand. I'm getting confused.
It's essentially because it just can't find the endpoint. I've seen post requests that do give you 404s if you can't find an endpoint. But yeah, it's simply just because it's trying to hit an endpoint that doesn't exist yet. Yes.
Is this how Flask works, essentially?
The route.
404 response.
Yeah, so the question was, is this how Flask works when you hit an endpoint and it doesn't exist? You get a 404 typically? Yes, you do. Yeah. What we need to do is import that function. So we're going to import the, I always forget the name of it. It will be save stock. So we're going to import save stock as well. And just trying to think, is there anything else we need to do? I think that's okay. Yeah. And we're going to run that test, and it should pass now. Oh, it doesn't pass. Why not? So let's have a look. Have I forgotten to do something? Must be a mapping. Oh, I think I know the reason to this. I may have made a mistake. Save stock request.json add.db. And then what you've done here in the root. No, that's correct. Save stock. Yep, that's fine. And in the test, what have I done? My integration test, let me check that. Do json.load, data.json, dumps, stock data. That should work. Let me try and fix that then. And the error we're getting is coming from test stock. Yeah. It might be to do with this. It might be something in the README, but let me check. Oh, because it's a list. Yeah, okay, so you do need that. Sorry. This was working and now I'm trying to figure out why. Data.json dumps stock data. Yeah, what I'll do is I will just copy that block in into the integration test. App.models.stock must be a mapping. function, yeah, sure. In app.py. Save stock is here. Is that what you want? You'll forgive me, it's not actually working for me, so I've got to figure this out too.
Does JSON.load return a string?
It should be just a Python list of dictionaries. We've got to wrap it up. Okay, cool. Right. Cool. Oh, hang on. No, that should be correct.
Oh no, you have to change the path again. Like what you did last time with the
Oh, okay. Well.
test stuff. You gotta change it to the test stuff.
Oh, in the integration test. Yes, you're right. Thank you. Yes, I was wondering what that was. So, thank you very much for that. So if I go to copy relative path, in the integration test, I'm going to change in test integration. Yes, good spot. Hopefully that will work now. Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So yeah, I think when I was doing my readmes and changing stuff, I forgot to change that. So yeah, stock test JSON. Cool, let's move on. So now that we've got that integration test, the next thing that we want to do, which we've just done here, when you save a stock, what happens when you try to save a stock? Sorry, was there a question? Yes. It didn't pass the test. Okay. Can one of the DevOps assistants please help out? I'm just aware that we've got some time constraints here. Is that possible? At all? No? They've gone somewhere. Someone will come and help you though. Yeah. Sorry. This individual here. Yeah. Right. When you try to save a stock with an existing ticker symbol, for example, Microsoft or Apple, what will happen when you try to do that? We don't want it to upload again. We want to stop it from having duplicate ticker symbols. So what we've got here is in our integration test, we've got, our unit test, I'm going to go to test_unit. We've got a function here called test save duplicate stock rejected. I'm going to uncomment that and I'll explain what's going on in here. So we've got this block of code here called prices, and that's just simply a list of dictionaries. What we're going to do is create our own stock and put some attributes in there, put an existing ticker symbol in there, and then we'll put prices on the end. And the way that we do that is in our README, we're going to copy these two lines here. Okay. What this is doing is that it's initializing a stock object, so that's just simple class initialization. To create an object, we're passing in an analyst, a name. The key piece here is that we're passing in MSFT, which already exists in our database, as we've seen. And then prices is this prices list that we've got here. So we're creating a stock. We're then going to convert it to a dictionary, and we're going to try and save it to our database. And if I scroll down, we've got this exception handling piece of test code here. Now PyTest, if I uncomment this, PyTest gives you the ability to detect exceptions and tell you when that exception is being raised, and you can also check an error message in there as well, which is what this is doing. So what it's saying is, if you find that an exception is raised, I want you to check the exception and check that it's got this error message when you call this function. That's a piece of PyTest functionality there. Other test frameworks will deal with this differently. So that's what that's doing. And if we run that, that should fail. And it's saying that it didn't raise the exception. In other words, it ran save stock, it did the upload, but it couldn't find the exception that we're looking for. So that's no surprise, because we're not really telling save stock to raise any exceptions. So we're going to fix that now. So I'm going to go to save stock, and this block of code here is going to help us with that. So I'm going to uncomment this line. you can see that we're getting some kind of indentation error. So I'm going to highlight from line 46 to 50. I'm going to press the tab button to put it within the else statement. And what this is doing is that it's using getStockByTicker, which is what we implemented earlier. We're passing in our ticker symbol, and then what we're doing, and what this line is basically saying, is that if we get a non-none object, in other words, if we get our stock back, that means it already exists, because getStockByTicker found something, and it's going to raise an exception and say this already exists. If, however, we get none, or the else part of it, if we get none, then all the stuff we saw before about opening the DB, uploading the JSON to it, we're then going to write to it instead. That's what we're going to do here. So, save that, I'm going to run it, and it passes. So there's a check to see that it's raised the exception when you pass in MSFT, and it's raising it with this particular error message. And if you go back to save stock, what we've got here is that we've passed an error message to our exception to say stock, the ticker symbol that you want, which is what this variable is passing, already exists. So it's checking not only for the exception, but also for that error message. And this is just an example of where you can use TDD to also check negative cases as well, not just happy path cases too. So you can check both sides of that. I believe we have an integration test to check that too. Oh, okay, I've jumped the gun. Let's do a little bit of refactoring. So what was the refactor? Okay, fine, right. I'm just, yeah, okay. So this again is some duplication that we've seen before of opening the database and getting the list of stocks. Hopefully you'll see that we can replace this instead with get all stocks instead to just make that code a little bit more cleaner. And that still, again, should pass. I'll run it all, actually. There we go. That's a little bit of refactoring. The refactoring we're doing here is fairly noddy, but if you're dealing with larger applications, you can then do some refactoring there as well. And you may be tempted to try and force a design pattern on a particular problem that you're solving. I find that TDD can kind of help you understand what you're trying to do, and hopefully you can come up with more succinct code that better suits what you're trying to do, rather than force feed a particular algorithm or design pattern that you may think is really cool, but perhaps is not best suited for what you're trying to do. Right, so that's a little bit of refactoring that we've done there. So we've moved it to an else clause. I'm going to skip this. No, I think we've done this already. Yeah. Yes, so what we'll do is we will now do our integration test. So in our test_int file, there should be a test here. That's get stock. Yes, test add stock duplicate rejected. So I'm going to uncomment this block. And what this is doing is still the prices structure that we've seen before. It's going to give us a response when we pass in the MSFT ticker symbol. And the assertion that we want it to do is we want it to return a 400, which is a way of saying a bad request. So what we can do is just copy this assertion at the bottom and say, when you run this request, give us back a 400 response. And hopefully we'll get that. If we run this test though, I don't think we will. And that's because we get the exception, but we're not getting the status code that we expect. So we need to write some code to handle that. So if we go back to app, this is what this try catch block is about, which I've commented here. So what we're going to do is uncomment the try. In this block of code here, we're going to indent it, and then we're also going to uncomment the exception. Oh, sorry, wrong one. we go. And what this is doing is that it's going to raise an exception and it's going to raise the status to be 400 when it catches the exception. If I run that, that passes now. So there's an example of where we can also test the response code and negative response code as well when we run this. Cool. So we've done the failing test. The last piece of functionality we're going to implement is getting a stock and then converting the prices to a particular currency code that we're interested in. So in our unit test, we've got this block of code here. Now, you'll notice that it's using something called request. Now, request is a very popular Python library that's used to make REST calls to various endpoints. So it's fairly popular for those who use Python. Now, if we go and visit this URL, this is a public URL, that a public endpoint that I didn't write. It's a public API. And what this is that it gives you the exchange rate relative to the dollar for different country codes. That's what this is doing, and it's inside this dictionary called rates. What we're going to do is we're getting the rates, we're getting the exchange rate for the UK, GBP, and then what we're going to do is apply that to a stock and map the prices to it. So what we're doing here is we're getting the stock by a ticker, so we're going to say Apple, and then we're going to do a transform on that. So the way that we do that is we're going to use this lambda function here using the map keyword. What this does is that it gets the prices from stock expected, and we run a map function over it where for each value we multiply it by the exchange rate which we pulled out of rates when we made that call, and we're doing it to prices which we passed earlier. And that will give us a Python list of dictionaries where each value has been multiplied by the exchange rate that we got from that API. Does that make sense? Great. And then we need to do some form of assertion on it. So we're going to call the function, and then what we're going to do is check that the expected prices that we get from our function is that we've calculated is equal to the actual prices that we get back. And just for good measure, we're going to check that the ticker symbol is still going to be Apple and that it hasn't got it from, say, another stock. Okay, so I'm going to pass that in. I'm going to clean that up, so just fix some indenting there. I'm going to run that, and just to speed things up a little bit, I'm going to import that stock, which will be get. Sorry, I need to uncomment it. So I'm going to go to components. I'm going to uncomment this, get stock with conversion, and then I'm going to import it into my unit test. That's going to fail, I believe, because we haven't implemented anything yet, and we can prove that. With get stock with currency conversion, yeah, we're getting none. So if we go back to our components, one of the benefits that I've seen with TDD is sometimes the code that you write in your test code, as you're thinking about what to do, you can reuse it in your application code. So the reason why I'm mentioning that here is because the request logic to get the rate, I'm just basically repeating that from the test code. So sometimes when you're thinking about how to assert that your code works, you may find that you're kind of reverse engineering your solution anyway, which is an added bonus to TDD in my opinion. So this we've seen already. What we now need to do is return that stock because there's no return type. There's nothing being returned. So what we do is we return the stock, which is fairly straightforward. And that's just going to return what we get back. And you can tell it's just doing the same calculation, the exchange rate. And if we do that, it should pass. And what that's telling us is that the exchange rate, when applied to this conversion, is what we expect it to be. Now, one might argue you're basically applying the same mathematics here in both your test and your application function. Therefore, are you not just marking your own homework? Yes, although what I would say there is that you can test this in other ways. You could get a file with some predetermined calculations and do it yourself and map there. This is where mocking becomes important, because what I've done is I'm making a real API call and getting the current exchange rate. If you were to mock that and fix the values to an expected value, then that would work. So if I was to go back around again and apply it again, I'd probably stick the results in a file and assert it that way. And that's another way of asserting that your code works. For the sake of time, though, I've just left it as making real API calls. Next bit is we're going to write an integration test, and we're going to go to our integration tests, and we're going to uncomment it. We'll just try and find it. There it is. So you can see that we're using an endpoint called stock conversion. We're passing in a ticker symbol, and we're passing in a country code as well. So that's how a user is going to use it. And then we're going to make some assertions on it. So we're getting the response. We expect to get one stock, we convert it. And I haven't really spent some time to assert the values that we're getting back, because we've done that at the function level. But here I'm just checking what the status code is. And that will fail because I don't think we've implemented that yet. Yep. Yeah, so we're getting a none type. So what would we need to do? We would need to go to our app, and we need to implement the root, which is a GET request, and then we'll implement that block of logic here, which is pretty much the same logic as what we did for our get stock by ticker. Albeit we're just calling a different function. As a refactor, I'm not going to do this straight away for the sake of time, but as a refactor, you could put this into one function and call it that way too. You could do that as a helper. And it still fails. Let me have a look as to why. It's not, oh, sorry, I need to import it. I just forgot to do that. In the app. Yeah. Where's it gone? Now that passes. And I think in terms of functionality, that's it. We didn't start up the application at all throughout this development, which may be foreign to the way that you're used to doing development, which is write some code, start up an application, see if it works, go back. And what we've done here is we've done pretty much all of our development with unit testing and integration testing. I want us to see that it works now in the real world when we do that. So what I'd like you to do is, in the application, I'd like you to go to components. If you go to the top, because of the way that this playground is set up, we have different containers for how we host our applications. So at the top, you can see we've got one for outside of the container and one for inside the container. And our DB path is currently set to what's inside the container. What I'd like you to do is copy the directory that goes to outside container. Sorry. And I'd like you to replace that with the assignment to DB path. So that should now be your new DB path. Okay? And then what I'd like you to do next is go to your WETI terminal. I'll leave that. And in... right, okay. Let me go back up and, sorry, I just need to go back up and get my WETI terminal back. Yep. I may need a hand with this if you don't mind.
It's your IDE, but instead of 8,000,
Yeah.
Instead of colon 1000, you change to /50.
Say again?
So instead of the colon 8000,
Yeah.
it's just /wetty.
Yes. So, yeah. I was used to doing this in a slightly different instance. The password, if you enter in your password, is it Python 23? Yeah. Pardon? Python 23 with a capital P. So Python 23. Let me try that again. Yes, you should get that. What we're going to do is we're going to navigate to our application and we're going to try and start it up. So we're going to go to the work directory. We're going to go to the hands-on test-driven development. So we're inside our application now. What we're going to do is back in the IDE, I've put this under test notes.txt. What I've done here is I've got a Flask command which I'm going to copy in. I'm going to go to back to Wetty. Yep, paste that in. What that does is that starts a development server, and it's on port 5000. And if we go back to the playground notes, it's exposed the port. So I'm going to go to the funny pandas play. Oh, that might change. Is it now sweet pandas, I believe? But I'll try it and see if I need to change the URL. Yes. Okay. So that needs to change to sweetpandasplayground.org. Yes. Sorry, I've put in funny panda, but you need to change it to sweetpanda.org. Or yeah, it's going to be the same as your IDE, but it's just going to have 5000 and then stock all stocks. And there we go. So we've called the all stocks endpoint, and we're getting back all of our stocks. So you can play with that, and you can add some other things. So if we try another endpoint, which will be, we can go to our roots for that. So yeah, let's do stock ticker. Sorry, there's 2 slashes. And rather than ticker symbol, I'll put in, say, MSFT. And we get back the specific stock for our endpoint. And then in our notes, I'll have to change this a bit. In our notes, we've got a command here for adding a stock. So I'm going to change this a little bit to point to our instance. And this is a curl command. And the way that you can address that is if you just open another instance of Wetty in another tab and log in again. Yep. And I'm going to try and run that curl. Hopefully this will work. Ah, it already exists, so I would need to put in a different one. But that proves the negative case at least. So then what we can do is rather than MSFT, let's make up a different one. Let's do Tesla, for example. Success equals true. And if we go to our database now, it's updated the database with our entry. So the reason why I'm doing it this way is because I want to show you that, yes, you could fire up the instance every time, you could run it through your pipeline, but by doing everything in a TDD way, we've got a faster feedback loop, and therefore you address your mistakes quicker. You don't have to wait as much to validate your assumptions. And so by the time you make it to deploying your environment, most likely it's not going to work straight away. You're still going to have to deal with some environment issues, but the odds of you having longer feedback time reduces because you're not dealing with the infrastructure lead time of waiting for it to deploy. So I hope that makes sense. Great. Let me go back to the slides. So the benefits of TDD here is hopefully you get a higher confidence in your application. When your product owner comes up to you and says, can you add this feature? Because you've got that regression pack set up, as you've been developing, you have greater confidence that you can change your code. Arguably, you could say that putting all your unit tests at the end can also give you that confidence as well, because you still get your test pack at the end, but the benefit of doing it this way is that your tests help you in your development and catch your errors quicker. As we've seen, your work can be done almost independently of infrastructure. So imagine if you needed, say, if your instance wasn't down and you weren't able to start up a server, you could still continue to do some of your development offline based on your understanding of the application and what it's supposed to be doing. The opportunity for emergent design. So as you're building, you can, as a developer, determine for yourself as you're growing your application, what design patterns match, what algorithms, what libraries should you be using as you go along, rather than trying to predict that through a planning session or through a design session. It's the opportunity for you to design as you go along, which, depending on your own feelings, you may like that or you may not like that, but the opportunity is there. This is a controversial one. TDD, does it make you a faster developer? I would say yes, in the long term. In other words, if you're building large-scale applications, I would say yes, it can, because you get that faster feedback loop and you are able to change things more frequently. You can catch bugs early, and if you're writing code in such a way that it can be tested easily and you're writing those tests, I would argue that your code is easier to understand and easier to maintain. As an example, on my current project, we do prod monitoring. So my job is that we have a schedule and I will check for any broken builds in production. And if something's broken, even if I didn't write the code, I'll check out the branch, I'll run someone else's tests and see what the problem is. So that's really helpful if you're doing that in a TDD way. Drawbacks. Initially longer dev time. I would not recommend TDD if you're writing a simple throwaway script. I think that's overkill. I think it's probably quicker just to develop straight away. And I would not possibly recommend TDD if you've got people breathing down your neck and they just want something out in production. Mind you, if you're working in that kind of environment, I would question why. But if you're unfortunate enough to be in that environment, then maybe TDD might get in the way when you just need to get something out quickly. Does it solve all your testing problems? No, absolutely not. If you're a UX designer, I would say TDD might not be the best thing to validate the assumptions that you want from UX. There's other things to do with infrastructure as well. So again, as another example, I wrote some Python code that manipulated files in a TDD way. It worked locally. It was beautiful. Once I did deploy it to the application, I found out that it had problems reading files because it was using AWS directories instead. And so TDD is not going to solve all of those problems locally, because you may have problems on your infrastructure that you need to tweak your solution for. So by no means is TDD a silver bullet. And I wouldn't say this is a TDD disadvantage. I would say this is just more of a regression pack disadvantage, but when the application change, so do your tests, and you need to maintain that as well. If you're dealing with a project where the requirements have not been fully decided yet, TDD might be a pain, because you're writing tests as you go along, you've got your assumptions working, and then all of a sudden someone comes along and says, yeah, we're not doing it that way anymore, we're doing it this way, and you find yourself having to rewrite tests all the time. So I find that when I'm dealing with requirements where that haven't been solidified, I will sometimes either write basic TDD tests with some flexibility, or I just won't do it at all. That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate we've overrun, so thank you for your patience. And I just wanted to thank the wider Global Logic team for their support in delivering this as well, for setting up environments, listening to me whinge about whether or not this works or that works. So thank you for them. And I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of this, and I appreciate any feedback. This is my first time doing this, so if you feel that this wasn't useful, or if you feel it could be done better, please come and see me in private, and tell me, and hopefully I can improve and do a better one next time in the future. So thank you very much, all of you. Thank you.